Hey, Stewart's Chapel, this is Don Pierson here, and Don counts behind the camera, and we're at the Fogg's home, and we really appreciate their hospitality. In fact, the rest of these devotions on fasting will be done here at the Fogg's home. Today is Wednesday, November the 18th devotion, and actually, you probably thought, well, we finished fasting. I want to deal with some of over the next few days, I want to deal with the whys, what are the benefits, why is it neglected? In other words, just deal with some of the details, even about what are some things you need to be thinking about when you fast. And so today, I want to deal with the question, why? Why fast? Through the years, as I've taught on fasting, even at the seminary or the college level, some student or someone or in a church, somebody would come up and say, well, why fast? Well, I usually looked at them and did what I think Jesus would do. In fact, what Jesus does in the Sermon on the Mount. First of all, a Jew would have never asked that question. You know that? A Jew would have never asked the question, why fast? And it seems to be a question that is more in the line of Baptists, question we ask, I know because we don't understand it, but the same reasons. For example, if somebody asked you why you pray, well, you would give them a list of reasons. If somebody asked you, why should I give, why should I tithe, you would give them a list of reasons. Did you know that the same reasons that you would give someone for why they should pray or why they should tithe are the same reasons given in Scripture for you to fast? We've looked at Matthew chapter 6, and if you remember in Matthew 6, he starts out with, when you pray, then he says, when you give, and then he says in verse 16 of chapter 6, when you fast. So let's read that Scripture. Moreover, when you fast, do not be like the hypocrites with a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces that they may appear to men to be fasting. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that when you do appear to men to be fasting, so that you do not appear to men to be fasting, but to your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. The language that Jesus uses in relationship to prayer, the giving of alms, and fasting are all the same. It's just like he could have said basically, when you pray, when you give, and when you fast, do this. Because he repeats himself basically 3 times as he talks about each one. And he could have easily said, when you pray, when you give, when you fast, do this. Fasting is taken for granted in Scripture throughout New Testament, Old Testament. I've already showed you and proved to you that there's actually more percentage-wise on fasting in the New Testament than there is in the Old Testament. It is not a question whether fasting is a New Testament teaching. It is a New Testament teaching, just as much as praying and giving are. I've made a list of some E's. I'm going to go ahead and give you the E's. If I had it on a chart, it would probably be easier for you, but I don't have that. So I'll take my time and repeat these E's. The letter E that I use to help me to understand why I should fast. Well, first, evidence. Evidence. I'll go ahead and give you all of them, and I'll come back and talk about each one. Evidence. Second, an example. The third one is also example, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Fourth, an expression. Expression. Fifth, enhancement. Enhancement. Sixth, encouragement. Encouragement. And last E is the embracing. Embracing. The evidence of obedience. You pray, one of the reasons you pray and give is because it gives evidence that you are submissive to your Lord. It is the evidence of obedience. The same thing is true for fasting. A person who doesn't fast, who's a believer, is failing to give evidence of obedience. Remember, the key word is when you pray, when you give, and when you fast. In other words, it's taken for granted that praying and giving and fasting are a regular part of your Christian life. And so if fasting is not a part of your regular Christian life, then you have failed to give evidence of your obedience. The second E is the example of so many. The example of so many. Fasting from the Old Testament through the New Testament is we're not only told or instructed to fast, and not only instructed how to fast, we are given examples over and over again in the Old Testament and the New Testament of God's people who fasted. Nehemiah, Ezra, Daniel, Jeremiah. When you move, and many more in the Old Testament, the Israelites every year on the Day of Atonement, they honored the Sabbath by fasting. As you move into the New Testament, you find Jesus even rebuking the disciples when they ask, why can't we do anything? He says, because this time doesn't come out but by prayer and fasting. As you move through, you find the early church in Acts fasting. You find fasting being the first part of Paul's life. Paul even says in fastings often. As he talks to husbands and wives, he encourages them to have a time separated for prayer and fasting. The example of so many. The evidence of obedience, the example of so many, and the second example is the example for so many. Remember, the example of so many and the example for so many. I'm convinced that we live in a church period where fasting is so rare that God's people need examples. They need to see individuals, groups of individuals, families, and churches that will covenant together in fasting for the example of so many. There are so many that don't have any understanding of the biblical spiritual discipline of fasting, that fasting is needed, the example for so many. The expression of dependence. If you remember, one of the words that the Jews used when they talked about fasting was to humble themselves. Fasting is an act of declaring hunger. Hunger that is greater than the normal things you hunger for, like sleep, like food, like drink. So hungry for the presence of God that you seek to humble yourself, to submit yourself to seeking Him through fasting, that sets forth an expression of dependence. You are dependent upon Him, hearing you and responding to you. Fasting is not the only one that is an expression of dependence. The prayers of crying out, the prayers of lament are also expressions of dependence. The enhancement of faith. The enhancement of faith. My own example, in periods of fasting, I have seen and experienced a growth of faith like at no other time in my life. Fasting so puts all your attention on God that in that midst, you begin to see things that you normally wouldn't recognize, and something happens in your life. Your faith begins to grow. It is challenged. it is heightened. The encouragement of intimacy sought. Just a moment, my wife is going to walk behind me. She's coming through the door. That's all right. Say hello, Trish.
Hello.
I'm talking about encouragement of intimacy sought. You know that I enjoy spending time, just me and my wife. I enjoy that because I enjoy the intimacy that is developed by me drawing near unto her. Fasting and prayer are ways that you and I seek the Lord with all of our attention. I'm going to tell you, if you've never fasted, and if you try it, you will find that in periods of fasting, you find that your seeking is heightened, and that the intimacy with the Lord moves in a direction of newness. The embracing of a burden. Throughout Scripture, most often when an individual fasts, other than the times that were prescribed or called for by God, fasting is probably one of the strongest embrace that you and I can give to a burden. A spouse will sit in the hospital alongside their spouse, and they will seek the Lord by fasting, sleep, food, their normal things. They have a burden, and they are embracing that burden. Nehemiah had a burden, and he embraced that burden by prayer and fasting. Ezra had a burden, and he embraced that burden with prayer and fasting. The early church had a burden, and they embraced that burden with prayer and fasting. You know, there's all kinds of hugs. I'm a hugging preacher. Now, I'll shake hands, I'll do fist bumps, I'll bump shoulders, I'll rub heads. Every now and then, Melvin Mitchell will come in and he'll give me a holy kiss. I'll even do the holy kiss. Not to everybody, to a few. But every now and then, someone will move through that line at the end of the service that will be God has moved and given them a heavy burden, and they'll give me a hug. And it won't be like anybody else's hug. It'll be one of those hugs that latches on. A hug that is strong, stronger than they probably realize. I can feel their bodies heaving. I can hear their chest as their heart beats faster. And every now and then I can hear their sobs. Embracing a burden through fasting is that kind of hug that you give to the Lord. It's that reaching out and embracing Him with a hug that holds on. Have you done any fasting lately like that? Love you, Stewart Chapel.